G'day you mob, and welcome to another episode of The Goss. This is where I sit down with my old man, my dad, every single week, and we chat about news and current affairs, things that are going on in Australia, and it is called The Goss, remember, because what's the goss is short for what's the gossip, meaning what's the news, right? What new things do you have to tell me, whether about the world or about you? What's the goss, right? Give me the goss. So today, guys, we talk all about coronavirus. You know, what's going on in China at the moment with this new severe flu virus that's kind of like SARS or MERS that sort of came about in the 2000s and 2010s. We also talk about political corruption in Australia. We dip into that a little bit with the sports money allocation scandal that's currently gripping the Liberal Party in Australia. We also talk about freedom of speech versus your role when you have to work, right? Because there are a few celebrities in the sporting world who are incredibly religious but have very conservative views that contradict what most Australians think. So anyway, there's loads of content in this episode. Guys, don't forget, if you want the full episode, you will need to be a member of the Premium Podcast or the Academy, which you can sign up for at www.aussieenglish.com.au. I hope to see you there so that you can enjoy the full episodes. But aside from that, let's get into today's episode. Dad, smack the kookaburra and let's get going. All right, Dad, welcome to episode 4 of The Goss.
Hey, Pete. Good to be back.
What's The Goss?
The Goss is it's bloody hot outside.
Yeah.
41 degrees and
Oh
going to
my
be
God.
hotter tomorrow.
It's bloody hot inside.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kel almost died. She went to the dentist and decided to walk it because I had to take care of Noah while he was sleeping. So that was a poor choice. Poor thing. Anyway, so how's the week been, Dad? What's been going on? What is the goss? What's your goss?
My Goss isn't much, really. It's just been watching a bit of tennis, doing a bit of work. I was teaching last night. There's not much else going on other than the coronavirus seems to be the thing that's, even though it's not happening in Australia much. There's a few people that seem to have been infected, but
Yep.
It's been the headlines throughout the week.
Yeah, I haven't seen much else on, right? There's been pretty much just that in the news constantly, and then just political stuff, which we sort of try and avoid because it's pretty boring most of the time.
Well, it's the same political story that just won't go away. Yeah, the
Yeah.
sports funding rort just won't go away, but that's probably not terribly interesting.
Or do you want to mention
your
that
listeners.
quickly, just so that people know what it is when you say sports
Oh,
funding?
yeah.
rules?
Well, last year there was a $100 million grant created by the federal government and smaller sporting bodies, so not the major sporting clubs and associations, but smaller bodies, could apply to the Department of Sport to get grants for capital works to improve the sporting facilities for their club. And it appears that this was occurring at the same time that we're leading up to a federal election, and it appears that there were a lot of those grants given out to sporting clubs in seats that were either Liberal National Party, the current government, and then the government that won the election, or were very close. And so it was, there's a lot of accusations of pork barrelling, and so it's been backwards and forwards a lot around that.
What do you mean when you say pork barrel?
Pork barrelling as in funding projects that will increase the likelihood of people voting for you at the next election.
Yeah. It seemed very dodgy, right? And I was surprised. I sort of say this to Kel because we're always talking about Brazil and the sort of corruption that happens in Brazil politically. And, she's moved here. She's lived here for almost 5 years. And I'm like, there's still corruption here. It's just a sort of different kind. It's not as overt and it's much more subtle.
Yeah, the corruption here is political rather than personal.
Yeah.
There's a lot of countries in the world that can be accused of political corruption, but in many cases, they are where politicians are lining their own pockets. They're actually taking money for themselves.
Yeah.
In this case, the accusation was that they were granting government money to organisations in areas that were more likely to vote for them.
And who was it? Which was it? The sporting body or something was the corporation or the group.
Sports Australia, which is the body that would ultimately oversee these, were being instructed on how to give the grants out.
Yeah, because
they
they're the
had a
ones
set
who...
of criteria that you had to apply under, and then they were weighting the applications and rating them according to those criteria. And it's been demonstrated that a lot of people got grants that were ranked quite low, and people that were ranked higher were not given grants. Yeah. And funnily enough, a lot of the people who weren't given grants were in safe Labor seats, who were the opposition.
And didn't she give a bunch of money to one of the clubs that she attends?
Yeah, that she was a member of. Now, mind you, she'd only been a member of it for 4 days, but you know, she had joined the club, and then, funnily enough, the club gets money a week later.
It's still just astonishing for me, that sort of stuff happening, because you're kind of like, how do you not see that this is going to come out? This is going to see the light of day eventually, and your career's over.
Oh, yeah. And it's one of those classic things, I think, where clearly governments are responsible for granting the money. But once a $100 million grant had been handed over to Sports Australia, they were the ones who then managed the applications. They should have been the ones who were granting the money.
Yep.
So you hand it over to the various government departments to do the administration of it, which means that you can't be accused of bias. So anyway... Yeah, it's a weird one, but it's one of those ones where it just won't go away. Every day there's a new headline of somebody saying, "Oh, and you think that's bad?"
So aside from that, how was the tennis? I think in the last episode you were telling us you were off to the tennis.
We went. It was really good. I love tennis, as you know. I used to play a lot, and I love watching it. But as an event, it's just a really good event to go to. The facilities there are so good for players and visitors and officials and everybody. It's just a great place to go. We had seats in the second arena there, not the main Rod Laver arena.
Who was playing that night in Rod Laver?
In Rod Laver, I can't remember now. It's sort of all a blur. Yeah, a week later you forget who was playing, because I've watched a lot of games on television and stuff since. But and it's a great event to go to. There's lots of people there, but the facility now is big enough to cope with 75,000, 80,000 people turning up.
And some of the news there, Ash Barty got into the semi-finals, right?
Yeah, she lost this afternoon.
She did, but she was the first woman to do so in the last 20,
first Australian
30
woman,
years. Since 1984 or something?
Something like that. And the last Australian woman to win the Australian Open was 1978.
Yeah. And what was the other controversy there with, I think, recognising or putting someone in the Hall of Fame, that woman, I've forgotten her name.
Yeah, Margaret Court, who's the second arena, the one we're in. She was... arguably the female equivalent of Rod Laver, in that arguably the best female tennis player. Certainly 50 years ago she was.
Yep.
And this year is the 50th anniversary of her Grand Slam, which is winning the 4 major tournaments in the same year.
Yep.
And so this is the 50th anniversary of that. And so they were going to recognise that, which is perfectly reasonable. But she's had that arena named after her for a number of years now. But she's also... fundamentally religious, and she's been quite outspoken.
She's a pastor in a church.
She is, a Pentecostal church, and she's been quite outspoken on gay marriage and transsexuality and homosexuality, and there's a lot of people that are saying now that, well, ignoring her sporting prowess and sporting success, why would we honour somebody who is just out of step with modern day thinking, with naming a building after her?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because it's one of those things where you kind of like, you should have permission to be a Fruit Loop in our society.
Yes. Yeah.
And especially when your Fruit Loopiness isn't directly related to the thing for which you're being honoured.
Yes.
I can kind of see where it's kind of like, I don't care what your opinion is of eating animals if I'm trying to award you something because you were an amazing sports star.
Yeah,
it's kind of like, I understand she may have views that a lot of people, including you and I, disagree with, but I can also see that they're not really related to what she did 50 years ago as a tennis player.
No, exactly.
You know, who cares what her favourite colour is, or...
Yeah,
you know,
it is a hard one. I fall along the lines of saying that anybody has the right to any opinion they like about something.
Yeah, for sure.
But as soon as they make that public, then they are publicly accountable for it.
Yeah.
And if we as a society are going to name buildings, not just put up a monument, putting up a monument to somebis celebrating somebody's success for the career that they had. But if we're going to name a building after them, that goes on forever. And in 20 or 30 years' time, people are going to go, oh, Margaret Court, wasn't she that woman that was anti-gay?
Yeah.
That's because that will be the thing that will pop up when people do whatever the equivalent of an internet search will be in 20 years' time.
Well, and as a segue there, this kind of dovetails pretty smoothly with what happened in the rugby this past year, right? Do you want to talk about that and give a brief recap? Or nutshell review
of
what happened with the nut job.
The nut job, yeah. Well, Israel Folau, who is one of Australia's great rugby union and rugby league players, but again, fundamental Christian, and he has come out saying he was anti-gay marriage.
And this was on Twitter, right?
He was making statements saying that anybody who's gay is going to go to hell, and so on and so on and so on.
The ironic thing there, sorry to interrupt you, was that the part of the Bible where he's getting those quotes, condemning homosexuality, also condemn having tattoos.
They do.
And eating certain food.
The quote that he made was actually a misquote because he was cherry-picking out of two separate parts of the Bible and putting them together, which made them sound like, putting the two bits out of context together was not what the original intention of those passengers were. But that aside, and again, it's one of those arguments of, he's entitled to his opinion and he's entitled to make his opinion public.
And that's one of those difficult things for you and I, where obviously we're pretty staunch atheists, if you guys don't already know. We have no problem, though, with people like Folau having those opinions.
No,
you're
nor having him say it.
Yeah, exactly.
However, he was in breach of his contract with Rugby Australia, because they have an inclusive policy where they actively promote the inclusion of minorities, whatever those minorities are. And he was a serial offender. He had done it before and he'd been warned. And so it wasn't that he wasn't sacked for what he said. He was sacked for the fact that he said it and that he was told not to. So he was actually sacked for breach of contract. Which was really interesting.
It is very weird, though, how we had sort of these two sides of Australia coming sort of against one another, right? Saying he should be allowed to say whatever he wants, but it's kind of like if you had someone stand up there and say, I think all Muslims are going to burn in hell, or if you're an Indigenous person, you're not human, or something like that, we would have a completely different reaction to that than him saying something about Christianity and condemning homosexuals.
Yeah, exactly. And look, the irony of that is he ended up being sacked. He took them to court. There was a settlement out of court for a lot of money.
What was he on per year, though? Because this is why it was such a big deal, right? He was on millions of dollars.
He was on millions of dollars a year.
Yeah.
And he got,
under a contract for several years.
And he got millions of dollars as a payout as part of that settlement. The irony now is that he has been offered a job by a French rugby league club, and he has written a clause into his contract that he will not say anything like that, and he's agreed to it.
Yeah.
So you've got to ask, where are his principles? Are his principles for his religious belief or his principles for his bank account?
I think they're for his bank.
Exactly right. And so that's part of the problem. And just as a little aside to that, and this has got nothing to do with Australia or anything else, but that French club that he has joined is in an international league, rugby league, that runs in Europe. And I think the second or third match that he is likely to play in will be against Wigan Rugby League Club. And they have announced that match will be their gay pride match, where they will celebrate diversity. So they're basically saying to him, you can do and say what you like, but we're going to make this as difficult as possible for you.
If you really want that money, you're going to have to work for it.
Exactly. Look, it's a shame because he is such a good sports person.
Yeah. And
it's a shame that he has. He will be remembered for his religious beliefs, which is what he intended. But he hasn't had to suffer the consequences of being in breach of contract. The person I feel most sorry for, I think, in all of this, other than the people who he has insulted, anybody who is part of the LGBTIQI community was clearly insulted, and worse than insulted. They were condemned by him. But the person closest to him, his wife, has effectively lost her job because she wasn't fired because of it, but it was made perfectly obvious to her that it was going to be very difficult for her to continue her sporting career, and she's an international sports person as well. So,
what was she famous for?
She's a netballer. She's a New Zealand netballer, and plays not only for New Zealand but plays in the Australian New Zealand netball championship.
I think she's going to be laughing all the way to the bank.
Oh, yeah. I
because,
don't think she's going to be short of $1, but...
yeah, that was the most annoying thing, I think, that Rugby Australia had such a strong stance when he came out with those bigoted tweets and remarks publicly and just said, you're fired, we can't have you saying those sorts of things. You can work for us, but you can't say those sorts of things. You choose, right? But then they caved in and ended up just paying him out because they knew that they would be up for potentially losing a lot more
in legal fees to win the case, and they may not have won it.
Yeah, and that was one of those things where you're like, again, stand by your principles and follow it through.
Yeah.
Because it's
just badly handled everywhere. But,
Anyway, all right. Moving on then to the coronavirus.
Yes, viruses. And apologies to all those virologists and microbial geneticists out there for my pizza geneticist. He may well have more, but he's a population geneticist.
Yeah,
so,
I look at rats. I don't look at viruses.
Any of the things that we say now are going to be opinions rather than scientific facts.
I pretty much crammed for this episode looking up a heap of information about viruses, and I just realised just how complex the topic is.
Oh, yeah.
You've got DNA viruses, ANR viruses, you've got all sorts of different sizes, and how they interact. I mean, I don't even know where to really start with this, but I haven't...
Well, look, coronaviruses are like the common cold is caused by multiple viruses, but one group of viruses are coronaviruses. So this particular brand, it's hardly call it a species. It's arguable as to whether you call it a species or not, but this particular type of virus has mutated and evolved very recently. But it is evolved from a group of viruses that most people in the world are immune to, or just have very minor effects by them.
Well, the very first, like, because I was looking into what a coronavirus is, I hadn't heard of it before, and they're RNA viruses as opposed to DNA viruses,
which makes them small.
Yeah, and they're from Corona viridae, which viridae is just the plural for Latin, I think, for virus, Latin or Greek. Because I was looking at why corona, and it means the term comes from corona, meaning crown. And when you see a picture of this virus, it looks like it has all these protein things. Yeah,
because they have these little protein clumps around them over the surface. But obviously, when you look at an electron micrograph, that is a photograph taken through an electron microscope.
Yeah.
You're looking at a two-dimensional plane through that 3D, and so those little protein packages that are sitting around the surface look like a ring around them.
Yeah. So the first coronaviruses were the common cold, which was discovered in 1960s. The 1960s, there were two of those. And then we have SARS.
SARS and MERS came in the 2000s and in 2012, I think MERS was.
1993, I think SARS was discovered.
Yeah, but the big SARS outbreak, I think, was 2001 too.
Yeah.
And then MERS was another one of those. And they're just mutations from common-ish coronaviruses.
Yeah, that have crossed over from animals, though, I think.
Yeah.
And the most recent one in the 2019 Wuhan virus has likely come from, they thought originally, I think on January the 1st, they thought it was a seafood wholesale market, because I think they had a whole bunch of people who had been to that market get sick. But now, more recently, from some of the articles I was reading, it seems like it could have come from either eating bats or eating snakes, which had eaten bats.
Yes.
Whether at that market or elsewhere.
Yeah, and certainly the study that I read that was released, I think, yesterday, was the one that was talking about the association with bats, in that the viruses that have been, the coronaviruses that have been found in bats are most closely related to this virus. And not related to viruses that have come from other animals directly. So it is most likely that it has evolved from them.
So I'll go through a timeline, I guess, of what's been going on. It was like December the 12th, first case detected. Only on the 31st was it reported. The initial source was unknown, potentially from bats and snakes. On January the 1st, that seafood wholesale market was shut down and looked at. And they'd been selling something like 112 exotic animals, including live koalas. They'd been selling crocodiles, salamanders, peacocks, wolf cubs, hedgehogs, civets, I think foxes, dogs, all kinds of weird animals.
This is not as pets.
No, to eat. To eat. Which is sort of part of the problem that we have humans, I think, sort of to enter in on before I finish this off. I was watching a few things on like Ebola and HIV, and it's because they think that humans are encroaching more and more and more on more and more wildlife. that these viruses are sort of coming out because we're coming into contact with things that previously we didn't come into contact because they were, deep in the rainforest or just not on the plate, I guess.
Yeah.
So January 7th, Chinese authorities confirmed that it was a new virus and they named it with 44 cases. On January 9th, they had the first death. January 12th, it was sequenced and shared with the world. January 13th, the virus got to Thailand. January 15th, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and the United States. January the 20th, it was human-to-human transmission confirmed with almost 300 cases. January 21st, we had 314 cases with 6 deaths. January the 22nd, 440 cases, 17 deaths, and it got to Hong Kong, Macau, and North Korea closed its borders. And then I guess, you sort of see the pattern, but it was just more and more cases, more and more deaths up to today, where I think we have 132 deaths and more than 6,000 cases. Which interestingly, when I looked at the fatality of that, right, 132 divided by 6,000, it's only 2.2%
much
fatal.
less virulent than MERS or SARS.
Yeah.
But it appears to be more easily contagious.
Yeah.
It's more contagious. So more people are getting it.
Well, that was the big
quickly.
thing that they found out, right, that it's transmissible during its incubation stage, so before symptoms erupt and are expressed. But I was watching one video by this Egyptian guy in the US. I've forgotten where's his channel here. It was a funny name for his channel. Let me find it. Medicosis Perfectionalis. And he said, prevention is better than cure, especially when there's no cure.
Yes,
and
it's a fair call.
But he was saying, to put it in perspective, over the last month, 1 million people have died from heart disease, 90,000 in car accidents, 50,000 in from HIV, 38,000 from just influenza, which is another coronavirus, and 132 from the coronavirus.
Yeah, and look, I think that's the challenge that we have, is that whenever there's a new virus discovered and it is contagious and potentially fatal, then rightly so, there's a sort of worldwide attempt to firstly understand it, identify it, and then try and prevent it. But we also don't want to shut the world down in a major panic when we also have things like, as you say, influenza. 10 to 20 times the number of people in the same period of time have died from influenza around the world. And we've known about influenza for 100 years. And so
why do you think it is that people freak out the way that they do when there's something like this that emerges, which is so clearly not as dangerous as other things that we look at as benign, right? It's kind of like being terrified of dying from snake bite when pet dogs kill more people.
Yeah.
But you would never be too afraid to pat your dog.
Yes.
But if you see a snake, you'd run screaming.
Look, I think it's the things that we are unfamiliar with and also the things that we can't control. There's very little that the average person thinks they can do to prevent them getting a disease like coronavirus or SARS or MERS or influenza. The reality is that for influenza, if everybody in the world got vaccinated, then we would have probably 1% of the number of people that suffer from it suffering from it. There are still going to be mutations and there's still going to be evolution of those influenza viruses that are not going to be able to be vaccinated for. But if we got vaccines for them, and we do, every year we have new vaccines for new strains of influenza. At the moment, there is no vaccine for a recently evolved virus like the new coronavirus. So that's one thing. The second thing is, wash your hands. That's the easiest way of preventing those things, is because these are airborne viruses. So either breathing it in directly, which is actually quite difficult to do, unless you're right next to somebody who is sneezing and coughing, but picking up viruses from other surfaces, or somebody sneezes near you and you pick it up on your hands, you don't wash your hands for half an hour, and then you're rubbing your eyes, you're putting food in your mouth, you're doing all of those sort of things. Just washing your hands with warm soapy water frequently, particularly if you have been around people who have those. And if you've got it, make sure you don't go out near other people.
I think it's interesting that it sort of happened as a perfect storm, right? Because you had this occur right at the time in Hubei province in Wuhan during, Chinese New Year as it was approaching, where you have hundreds of millions of people,
thousands of people out in feast in that city.
Yeah, eating off the same plates and everything too. So it's almost like, the perfect storm.
Yeah,
for a
but
virus like that
ironically for those things where we do have it.
G'day, mate. That was the first half of this episode of The Goss. If you would like to continue watching or continue listening to this episode, make sure that you sign up for the premium podcast or academy memberships at aussieenglish.com.au, where you will get full access to these entire episodes of this series and much, much more. You can go check that out using the links below or just go to aussieenglish.com.au. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, mate, and I will see you next time. Peace.